Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Sergey. I'm a developer experience engineer here at Sentry. Um, really excited for this one. It's a new type of series that we're gonna try and see if it's valuable or not, but at least gives me something fun and exciting to do. We are calling it Bug Us Live, and yes, it's bugs that are across your application, and you can bug us, as in ask us questions. And so, yeah, there are people joining. I see some people in the chat here. So if you want to say hi, let me know where you're calling from. And yeah, we have some questions that we received through our submission form. And then also for those of you that might not be familiar, Sentry also works with Syntax, which is a front end mostly. I don't know what front end or back end or AI is these days, but it's a podcast with Wes, Scott, and CJ. And they have this segment called Potluck where people can drop in questions and they get to them every once in a while and answer them. And so I asked Wes, I was like, hey, do you have some questions that were asked about Sentry that might not be specific to the full Syntax audience, but I would love to get them in here and take a look at them. And so he gave me a couple of questions, which is fantastic. So if I'm reading a question from our Q&A, or I'm highlighting it and it says, hey, CJ, Wes, Scott, they're directed for them, but I'm going to be fielding them here. But I think if we were to get started, there's also a Q&A section in the interface here. And so if you have questions that come up throughout this discussion or throughout me answering one of the questions, feel free to drop it in there and we'll try to get to it. Now, if you are watching it in a on the page and you see it a little bit like centered in the middle, there should be controls at the bottom of the panel, and it should be able to toggle it into full screen view. I might be sharing my screen and showing some stuff on the screen. So for you to be able to see it a little bit better, I recommend going into full screen mode. See my face in full screen. Awesome. I believe Alex has graciously preloaded some of the questions that were submitted. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take one from here. And let's get right into it. Add an overlays. Is that how I would do it? So the question is, my team is receiving way too many errors. They feel overwhelmed. So the adoption is pretty low. How can I improve this? Perfect. So it's a really good question. And I've talked to quite a few people that feel the same way. You set up Sentry, you set up your alerts, and by default, it's alert me on any high priority issue that comes into my feed. And then you forget about it and you get emails, you get Slack notifications about things that you are like, oh, I know this is happening. I don't want to see this anymore. This is not being useful. There are a few things, and again, this isn't going to be kind of like a one thing solves it for everyone kind of situation. But here are a couple of things that I want to showcase to start looking at your configuration and making sure that maybe there is some adjustments that you can make. Observability isn't like a one and done kind of thing. I believe that it is important to come back to it quarterly, maybe. Or if your traffic spikes and now it's twice as much as it was in the past, some of the thresholds or some of the things that you've set up in the past might not be adequate anymore. And so things that you might have cared about 3 months ago, you might not be your top priorities at this point. And so it's an evolving story, but here are kind of like baseline things that I think would be pretty good to talk about. I'm going to share my screen. And let's do picture-in-picture mode. Everybody can see me. This is our docs. I'll probably reference our docs quite a lot. But to begin, I'm gonna go into our project. This is my kind of demo organization with Sentry. I have a bunch of projects here. And so monitors and alerts is where we're gonna spend some time looking at this. Now, this question, this is a little bit of an insight, but I do recommend you take a look at this Q&A and FAQ guide. So historically, alerts were done a little bit differently at Sentry. And so recently we've rolled out this monitors and alerts as a kind of like a different way to configure things, where you configure monitors for things that you want to observe, and you can set up alerts from those monitors to create issues that then send you notifications through your communication channels, email, Slack, whatever. And so we've backfilled, I mean, this is the banner that we have here. Your existing alert rules migrated automatically. So I would definitely take a look at the ones that were migrated. Maybe there was a case where something did get migrated that wasn't supposed to be the way that it did, or something got lost. This is a good opportunity to take a look and see if something could be missing. Let's see, these are my monitors, and the way that a monitor works is if I go ahead and edit it, is this an issue group monitor? Monitoring type. So there's different monitoring types. You can monitor by errors, metrics, cron, uptimes, or mobile builds. Now let's take a look at, so these monitors got created by default, where essentially any new project, when you create it, it will get set up with a default monitor that you can disable or not. But we don't have any connected alerts here. If we go and edit it, so an error issue will be created when a new issue group is detected. So this is issue grouping. No, let's actually go through and create a new monitor. Right, so when you are creating a new monitor, you can set it up based on metric, mobile build, cron, or uptime. Now, metrics can be error counts, logs, application metrics, span duration, crash rate. So a lot of these things are highly configurable. You select the project that you want to create a monitor for. And this is one thing that I want to call out is environments. A lot of the time, this will be pre-configured for all environments. But for example, you have a staging environment that you do a lot of rigorous testing in, and maybe you run some end-to-end tests. And there are end-to-end tests that test for error scenarios. And if your monitor is set up for all environments, anytime your end-to-end tests or even unit tests run, you might be getting data ingested into Sentry from a test environment, and that could be triggering an alert if this is set up with all environments. So I would definitely encourage you to take a look at the environments and make sure that your monitors and alerts are set up for environments that you really care about monitoring. And the other thing, let me just get my notes here real quick, is you can do filtering. So like I said, we're going to take a look at the docs quite a bit. So we go back to docs and we go to filtering. This is using JavaScript as an example, but again, feel free to select whichever SDK that you care about or that you're using. And we will have a few ways that you can filter out errors to make sure that things that you know, for example, are going to be causing errors all the time. And you're like, I know this is happening. I just don't want to see it in Sentry. You can filter it at the SDK level. So at the SDK level, there is ignore errors parameter, which will be different for different SDKs. but it's essentially a regular expression where you can filter out the message that you don't want to show up in Sentry. So one way to do it. The other way to do it is using before send. So this before send API is specific to error events or issue events. And so whether it's based on a property of the user or an attribute or a tag that event will have, you'll be able to say, hey, I don't want to send these issues that are coming from this context of this cron job that is running in this specific environment, and I know it's flaky or it errors out in this specific case, and I just don't care about it. Allow URLs. So again, there could be third-party services that might be causing a downstream crash, and you can filter those out to make sure that they're not polluting your environment. Third-party filter integrations. Now, I've seen this before. I worked at a company and I was getting a lot of errors through a browser extension called MetaMask. And yeah, I wanted to make sure that those errors, because they're still running in the browser, it's the user's browser that is loading extensions. Those scripts get loaded and they are executing within the runtime of your application in the front end. So you want to make sure that you're not getting notified or catching errors that you have no way of controlling or doing anything about. So I think there is a way to do it through the SDK, and then we'll go back to the dashboard and we can take a look at a way to configure that there as well. So third-party error filter integrations, there's some filter keys and behavior. There's different types of behavior, so you can provide this for your SDK configuration. And then you can ignore transactions. I don't believe this is for like performance tracing or stuff like that, where you see some transactions that are causing some performance alerts. You might be able to ignore those transactions as well if you know which ones you want to ignore. Let's go back to the dashboard and take a look at an issue. For settings, I believe there is going to be, have to be project settings because this is configured per project. So we go to projects and we look for doesn't matter really, but let's just take a look at this React front end. In the settings, let me just expand this so it's always there. I'll increase the font size a little bit. You can set up inbound filters, and yes, there are filters for legacy browser errors where you never know what's going to happen in those. You can filter out health check transactions, which is neat that it's provided by default as enabled. Again, you probably don't want a /health check or a /ping transaction ending up in Sentry because that's not really data you can do anything about. You can even filter out events from localhost. This is disabled by default because if you're debugging and you want to see something in Sentry, it's always good to have it disabled by default. But again, once you're done, feel free to update this setting how you need to. So inbound filters are here. And the last thing that I wanted to cover is just kind of taking a look at your stats and usage. This is a good baseline for understanding kind of like general quota usage across all of your projects and figuring out which ones might be taking up a lot more of your quota, which ones might be a lot more noisy than others, because you can always configure a sample rate for not just your traces, but also for errors to make sure that some errors aren't ending up in Sentry as many times as 100% of the time. And that can also affect how those triggers and how those errors get sent to you. So this is for oh, there's more errors coming up here. Nice. So that one is, I'm going to mark it as answered, and we're going to move on. Question is, I am not sure about the benefits of Seer versus using the Sentry MCP server. Okay, let's take a look at how we can relay this. Show on stage. So that's the question. And right. So before we get going further, I just want to make sure that we are on the same page of what is being talked about here. So MCP server, for those of you that are familiar with MCPs, I'm sure this will not be a surprise to you that Sentry has an MCP server. It's at mcp.sentry.dev and very easy to configure with your favorite coding agents, whether it's Claude Code, Cursor, VS Code, or any of the other ones. You set up the transport, you give it the URL, you authenticate your coding agent with Sentry, and now your agent has access to tools that can invoke within the MCP server, and that will give it data from your Sentry environment. And so anything that is inside Sentry, you will have access to. Let's take a look at an example real quick. I'm going to start a new session here in the terminal. I'm going to load up Claude Code. And let's see, hopefully the MCP server is authenticated. Yeah, so Sentry, we are using an account that has kind of like connectors that are shared across our team. And so that's why Sentry is showing up here as Claude AI Sentry versus a standalone one. But the way that it would work is I would go back to Sentry, I would look at my issues, and I would take an error, copy the URL, go back to Claude Code and be like, what is going on here? Pasted the URL, and we should see it pick up the Sentry MCP and use a tool to see it's loading the Sentry tools and calling Sentry. And if we do Control O, you will see that we use the get Sentry resource using the URL, and we got some details about the issue. And Seer is Sentry's in-house built AI debugger. There are two things that it does with, there's two different Seers inside Sentry as well. You'll see you have this Ask Seer inside your Sentry, and it is across every single page, and it kind of doesn't go away. This is our Seer agent. It is in beta right now, and it is free to use, and it's always there for you, whether you have a Seer subscription or you don't. You can see it's pre-configured with some questions. What are some of the open issues that are getting worse, not better? So this is an agent that you can talk to, and it lives inside Sentry. It also lives inside Slack if you have the Sentry Slack integration installed. If you haven't updated permissions in a while, you'll have to reinitiate that connection to get the Seer agent or the Seer Sentry agent, so you can talk to it in Slack as well as inside Sentry. But the idea is that it will use Sentry context and help you answer the questions, and it'll actually build those queries that you're asking in plain English, and then it'll give you links for it to click on, and then you will get dropped into the actual representation of it inside Sentry, which I think is pretty cool. But when it comes to projects, Seer also functions in autofix and code review. And to be able to do that, you would go to your Seer settings for autofix, and this is where you would connect your source code management system like GitHub or GitLab, and you can connect it through, actually, don't quote me on the GitLab part. I know that we're working on it. I'm not sure if it's there yet or not, but I know for sure GitHub is available. You would essentially map your Sentry project to your GitHub repo, and then you have a way to hand it off to different agents. Seer is our in-house one, or you can hand it off to Claude, Cursor. I know Copilot is also available as of recently. And there are a few automation steps that you can get to. So you can stop at a root cause analysis, which essentially will give Sentry, like by the time it's done, is kind of like figures out this is actually the reason for this issue. Given the GitHub context, given the traces details, given logs, all this context that lives inside Sentry, Seer takes it all. It has a really good system that figures out what was the actual root cause for this issue. You can also extend it to create a plan for how to approach it, or actually create a draft pull request. And now a lot of the time we get a question of, well, can I just do this myself with my Claude subscription and an MCP server? Yes and no. Yes, you are able to run, and there's another question about automations, which I think will be super helpful to kind of like showcase this concept. There are a lot of errors that happen that are pretty surface level. And so whether it's your own coding agent or Seer, you give it some context, which is like the stack trace and some error message, and it will fairly easy figure out what's going on and how to fix that. The problem becomes a little bit harder to track down, and some of the things that the Seer MCP server, or sorry, not Seer, Sentry MCP server might not have as best of a chance with is something that has like distributed tracing. So it's multiple projects that go through this, like the error actually like ends up being somewhere unrelated to the stack trace that caused that error. And a lot of the time that I've seen when I'm developing with any of these coding agents is they're really eager and easy to kind of like set up try-catch blocks all over the place, set up conditions that you as a developer know will never be true, but it will be like, oh yeah, well, like if user dot something isn't available, and it's like, no, if that is not available, we have so many other problems beforehand that we need to make sure that we're aware of. So what you're setting up is completely bogus. And so Seer's kind of like context engine and a lot of the tooling that was built for Seer to work as well as it does is this kind of like domain knowledge and this context of this harness that isn't available out of the box with something that is off the shelf. Now, doesn't mean that you have to use Seer, or I'm telling you that that's the only way to do debugging. Definitely feel it out. If you find that Cursor automations with the Seer Sentry MCP server are doing the job for you, fantastic. I would love to learn more about the use cases that you have. And yeah, I just love learning about these things. And if there are things that you're seeing that the MCP server or like these updates, these fixes get made using the MCP server, and you're like, that's not really the root cause of it, I would encourage you to give Seer a try and see how that feels for you and your team. So the TLDR of it is the context engine that is pre-built inside the Seer. We see outperforms a standalone MCP server without that much context a lot of the times. But for a lot of use cases, the MCP server is just great as well. I see Andrew messaged and said that he might have asked some questions using Alex's name. That's totally fine. Let's go back to the Q&A. Let's respond. Let's mark this as answered. The next question, actually kind of related to this, is what are some examples of automations using Sentry? Let's go to the overlay and automations. Let's show that. So I actually should have our Sentry account in Cursor open up here. Hope I don't expose some API credentials or do anything really bad. But I have created this feedback to feature automation a while back while I was testing this automation. Now, the coolest part about Cursor automations versus what I've seen from Claude and Codex so far is there is first-party support for a trigger being a Sentry issue that gets created, assigned, or there is like a few configurations for triggers. Now with Cursor, I think they're called routines. They are pretty much set up on an interval basis. I think they're working on some webhook support for it not to just be like on a pull basis where like every single week something is happening. But I'll show an example of that too, which is also a very fair example of an automation using Sentry. But with Cursor, it's like anytime an event in Sentry happens, we can program it to do something using Cursor background agents. So inside our docs repo, so this is our docs application, and we have at the bottom of it this kind of like feedback, which is actually using Sentry user feedback, which is a product that Sentry offers. But when it isn't helpful, people can share their thoughts. And what happens is we have a Slack channel set up where this feedback gets posted. And as long as I assign that feedback to myself, let's go back to the automation. Nope. It gathers the context from Sentry. So again, this is a very good use case of the MCP server. It extracts the details of that user feedback. And then I give it some details of like, okay, if it's on this page, this is how it maps to our page system inside the actual code, because it's like markdown based, but then there's some like dynamic parts to it. It's a little bit involved, but agents at this point are pretty easy to figure this out right away. And we also have memory set up here. So there is a tool for memories that kind of keeps track of features, because sometimes maybe different users will submit the same feedback. And if I assign multiple times, I don't want to have 3 different PRs addressing the same feature as a feedback. And so we have a lightweight memory here, and we have it set up to assess and fix it. And it will create a PR, and it will post on Slack to that user feedback a link to the PR, so that it becomes this kind of like closed loop of, we see feedback. Again, we could run this on all user feedback. The problem is we are at the mercy of the feedback being clear, and sometimes feedback isn't, most of the time. And so that's why I left it as like human in the loop kind of thing, where I see the feedback coming through from someone on Slack. And again, I can be somewhere else checking Slack. I don't have to be at my computer. And it probably is something that would be really nice to fix, but it might not be planned throughout my workflow for the day or my to-do list for the week. And I don't want to forget about it. Instead of adding another to-do list item or a backlog item, I can just assign it to Cursor. It runs, it creates this automation. And then when I get to it, I can just test it and make sure that it fixed whatever it was to fix. And a lot of the time it's very small things like typos or something that doesn't make sense, which let the agent run, do it, fix it, push it to production, and we're good. Another automation that our team has set up is the CLI team has this weekly Sentry issue fix. And this runs every Monday at 8 a.m. Eastern. And this does a full sweep of, again, using the Sentry MCP, all the issues in the CLI project, This is a good time to shout out the CLI. This is a new CLI that our team is building that is kind of like answering the question of, I don't want to use the MCP server. What should I do to get my agents to get data from Sentry? The CLI is purpose-built, I think, for it to be really well consumed with agents and be able to get the same data that you are getting from the MCP server, but within the CLI. Again, the CLI can be extended to non-agentic environments, which is great because you don't have to be inside an agent to be able to query for things like debug files or logs or issues. It also has this init command, which is kind of like our agentic Sentry instrumentation. I'm really excited about this one. It's being worked on. More information about that in the future. But if we go back to the automation, again, we're discovering open issues via the Sentry MCP. We are reproducing and understanding each issue. So the best part about Cursor background agents is they actually come with their own sandbox environments where it can actually run through it. And the goal of it is to make sure that before you start fixing stuff, you can actually get to a point where that issue is failing for yourself locally. Like the same way that developers are debugging things locally, you want your agents to do that before it attempts any fix, because it really likes to assume what it knows it can fix and then tell you, oh yeah, I fixed it, don't worry. But it's like, hey, did you actually run it beforehand to make sure that it was broken and now it's fixed? And it's like, oh no, I just assumed things. So reproduce and understand the issue, fix and PR each issue independently. So again, this is a really good pattern because you don't want it to see that there are 5 open Sentry issues and then come up with one PR with 20,000 lines of code changed, and then you still want to make sure that you're reviewing it and you still want to make sure that you are in the process of understanding what kind of code is being shipped to your project. And so fix and PR each issue independently is a good kind of rule here. And then it posts a summary, I believe. It puts a table for kind of like easy scanning. And there was an example of this that I'm going to bring up right now. Oh. Am I opening it 20 times? Yes. So here's a draft pull request from one of the runs that it had. And again, it's set up with CLI, and the team is a fan of this automation, which is great. Probably small changes, which, yeah, you want to make sure that they're pretty small, really easy to review. And that's how you start building trust with your agents to make sure that they can execute on these things. And then you start, as models get better, as context gets better, you will be able to give them harder and harder problems to solve in the future. Okay, let's move on. How are we doing here? Q&A. I've answered that one. What are your best practices or strategies for determining an optimal trace sample rate? I'm working with Sentry for performance monitoring, trying to fine tune my trace sample rate. And okay, so I think trace sample rates, there's 2 questions that are similar. So let's set that as an overlay here, trace sample rate. Right, and I saw that there was a question from someone that is new to Sentry and wants to get more familiar with it. The best place to learn about all things Sentry from kind of like how it's being used is through our docs, which is at docs.sentry.io. It is a rabbit hole of observability and knowledge that kind of helps you understand why we built Sentry and all the things that we offer, which is a lot more than meets the eye at the surface level. We do get a lot of, oh, you guys do X versus like, we're not just error monitoring, which is awesome, but also sometimes hard to explain to a lot of people. Trace sample rate. So we are now kind of getting out of errors and issues as a concept and moving into tracing. At a high level, what is tracing? Tracing, let's just use our docs to actually look at these concepts. And we have this concepts documentation, which is, I think, a really good resource for understanding at a high level all the things that are Sentry related. Tracing, and yeah, so the anatomy of a trace is a really good example. It's essentially every single operation within your application will consist of different things that are happening. So you load a page in your browser that sends off a request to the browser sends off a request. It might go to the CDN. It might load. It gets the HTML page back. There's some resources there. It'll load the CSS script. It'll load the JavaScript script, and all those operations will be individual spans. And then you might have an API call to the backend service, and then that will have its own services that it calls. And so to visualize all of that for observability purposes, tracing is a really good product. You will have one kind of like long trace with a bunch of waterfall spans below it. And this is a way for you to understand which part of that experience took however long, why it took that long, and what you can do to improve it. You can see things that are being like called concurrently, or one thing depends on the other thing. So it really is a good way for you to figure out the life cycle of operations within your application. Now, as your application gets larger, you will have a lot more, or your application gets larger, or your traffic gets bigger. So like a lot more people start using your application. You might not want to track all of the data across all of the operations, because the same database lookup call will, whether it happens once or 1,000 times, it will most of the time kind of like be the same. And so that's where sampling comes into play, where you don't need to store the timing of that request 1,000 different times. You store it once. Like if your sample rate is 0.01%, then every 1,000th request will be stored, and you'll still get insight into how your application is performing without going over your budget. If we take a look at it in Sentry, let's go back to our project. This will be under traces. And let's take a look at SD distributed tracing. Yes, for example, SD distributed tracing. So I have these two projects that I just created. Don't judge the front end, because I literally did this 5 minutes before this presentation. But I just wanted to showcase, this is a React front end that calls a Python, Flask backend. And if we take a look at an example trace, starting with, let's take a look at, there should be a page load. Yeah, I think these are all page loads. And so, as I mentioned, you start with a page load, and then these are all the browser scripts that got loaded. A lot of the time, these are things you can't really control yourself, so you can't really improve the performance of these. So I would recommend there is actually an ignore browser scripts option for your Sentry SDK init configuration, just to make sure you have quota available for things that you actually want to track and care about. But as you can see here, there is an API health check that sends a request to the Flask backend. And you can see that like this is what we call distributed tracing, where even though the application is loaded with React, it is calling your Python service, which has a Python project configured for Sentry. And the way that this works is using request headers. And so every single request from a project that is configured with Sentry will have a Sentry-trace header and a baggage header. And what happens is when this request gets sent to the backend is also instrumented with Sentry, and it sees the trace header, it sees the trace ID, and it pretty much stitches the trace together, and you get this continuation of requests coming from one project to the other. So you can see that like sometimes when you load, for example, a product page on your e-commerce website, you want to make sure that you understand how long the database queries take to load all those products. And so we were talking about sample rates. I put together a little canvas in Slack for best practices. Let's take a look at this here. So trace sample rate is a head-based uniform sampler. There is tail-based sampling, head-based sampling. I'm not going to spend too much time going over them, but a rate of 0.2 means 20% of transactions are traced. And if your service starts at the front end and it propagates to the back end, I think that trace sample rate, the rate affects your entire trace volume, not just root spans. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind. So if you are first building your application, starting from scratch, and you're working locally, you might want to get a baseline. Again, depends on your setup, but if you want to get a baseline of the performance of your application, locally might not actually resemble your production environment one-to-one. So it's up to you if you want to do 100% sampling locally, or you want to save that quota and look at something, speaking back on the CLI, is it recently added a new command called local, which runs a version of Sentry locally. And once you configure it and set it up, you'll be able to actually see these traces without them ending up in Sentry, but you'll have a place for them to store locally, and your agent can hook into it and get insights from your traces without all of this data ending up in Sentry and you spending quota on things that you're doing locally. Because sometimes I will have a use effect that goes into or like something that runs away and then it blows through my Sentry quota very quickly because it recursively calls my database a million times. Don't want to have that happen. So yeah, and now when we talk about deploying this in production, depending on your traffic, again, you might want to set it to somewhere between 50% sample rate to 100%. And the reason it's like this is when you do initialize Sentry. So this is a project. This is the same project that I have set up. So this is an example of what it looks like inside a React application. You have your trace sample rate here, which you can set it as a environment variable if you want, or set it as 1, which means 100%. If we take a look at it on the Python side of things, again, This is also something that you can set from the environment or hard code yourself and set it to 100%. Or if we scroll down, there is also a way to fine tune your tracing. So there's a trace sampler function that you can pass to your Sentry init as well, where you will have a lot of context available to you to decide what things you want to completely discard, what things you want to sample at a higher rate, what things you want to sample at a lower rate. So again, for things like health checks or your just continuous pings to make sure that the service is running, your uptime page check, those probably don't need to be sampled because you just want to make sure that those are there, and they're probably there's nothing performant about them. You don't want to make them faster. You just want to make sure that they're up or down. This isn't not using uptime monitoring though. This is just specifically for gathering trace sample data for performance. And now if you have something that you care about, like if you set an attribute somewhere at runtime on your application and you care about those spans ending up in Sentry more often than others, you can set it up with custom attributes. And again, those attributes are going to come from the sampling context. And then there are things like the name of the transaction that, let's say, starts with checkout and payment. So those are your high, very critical things, but you still don't want to go through your full quota right away. You can sample them at 50%. And something that is completely not as necessary as the rest, you can undersample at 0.01, and then the default can be 10%. This is kind of like a volume estimator before you deploy. So daily transactions, requests per second times seconds in a day. And you can obviously multiply it by the rates and by 30 days. So this is kind of like napkin math for understanding how much quota you can have. Inside Sentry, again, one place that, where are we? That I like to go to is stats and usage. This is broken down by errors right now, but if we go to spans and we look at the last 30 days, we look at all projects, you can start to get an idea of which projects are taking up how many spans and figuring out sampling strategies per project this way. So that's dynamic sampling and distributed tracing. Let's go back to let's go back to the Q&A. There's a question about the replay quota. And replay quota, how do I protect user privacy with session replay? And I'm always over my replay quota. So let's talk about session replay real quick. And then this question also had get backend and front end errors correlated. With session replays, this is a video-like reproduction of all the things that a user did before they hit an error. Inside the app, this is what it looks like. If we go back to an issue and we look at any issue, whether it's front end, back end, doesn't matter. As long as your distributed tracing is set up, and so this backend error was caused by something on the front end, we should be able to see a session replay here. That's funny. First error example that doesn't have a session replay. Let's take a look at this one. There we go. So probably hit an error and that button threw an error. So this is what session replay looks like. When you are configuring your application, there are ways to configure you set up the replay integration. Now it has configuration for block all media, mask all text. By default, everything inside Session Replay is blocked for privacy purposes. So your text becomes stars. We don't show any images. This kind of like inverts all that, but there is way to fine tune it. I did want to talk about these two sample rates. And so again, everything in Sentry can be configured on its own. You have trace sample rate, you have sample rate for issues, and you also have replays sample rate. Replay session sample rate, this, if you kind of like don't care about observing how your users are using an application when something doesn't break, feel free to set this to 0, which again shows that, like, it just means that you won't get any session replays that aren't associated with an error. But on error sample rates, again, this is very highly volume related to how much traffic you're getting. Check your plan to see how many session replays you have available. I believe we give 50 out of the box. Don't quote me on this, but I think that limit might soon be getting bumped up quite a bit. Stay tuned for updates there. But yeah, if you are running through the quota right away, maybe update your session replay, the sample rate here, to make sure that you're not seeing errors for the same, you're seeing session replays for the same error over and over again. And then, as I mentioned, for configuring different privacy configurations for session replay, if we look at something like XJS, for example, privacy is a whole section in our SDK docs. So again, a lot of the questions, just feel free to come to the docs or even ask your coding agent, hey, can you find inside Sentry docs? Give it the docs URL. We have content negotiation for coding agents to get markdown information from our docs. It'll be fairly efficient. It'll be fairly quick, and you should be able to get these kinds of details. There is CSS classes that you can apply to different text or different elements to mask them or unmask them. There is data attributes. There is also ignore. So there's a lot of configuration here. I won't go through it in detail, but this is where you go for that. Part of that question was also distributed tracing related, and I showed that in the Sentry UI already. So if we go back here and we view the full trace, yep, we see kind of like the React one here, and then Flask ones as part of that. The only thing that, well, there's a couple of things that can go wrong, but one thing that I would double check is inside your front end, so inside this React application, Sentry configuration, there is a trace propagation targets option, which is an array of, again, regular expressions of endpoints that you want to make sure anytime that these URLs get called, they get the Sentry trace request header and the Sentry baggage request header get sent along with them. And then inside your backend application, there's no special way to handle stitching it together, because once the Sentry SDK is initialized, it should put it together. But there are docs on how to do this manually if you need to. And that will be, and let's go to Python, for example, and we look at tracing, distributed tracing, and custom trace propagation. So there is a get incoming headers as a dictionary, and then you can get the Sentry headers from there as Sentry trace and baggage. And then you just attach them to the transaction, and then that's how Sentry will stitch it together for you. All right, we are coming up to an hour. There are a couple more questions that I didn't get to, which is great because we have more questions for next time around. Let's take a look. Replay quota, so I answered that. Finding tuning trace sample rates, we answered that. Trace sample rates, we answered that. Noisy error alerting is super demotivating. You can look at the dashboard and be like, my goodness, it's more work than we engineers for. If you're feeling overwhelmed, instead of treating it as it gets added to the to-do list, try turning it all off, then pick one particular goal or important issue. As you become familiar and see the value, you can start adding on more things to watch for. Absolutely. Yes. I don't think this is framed as a question, but definitely good feedback. I am new to Sentry monitoring. What are some resource materials that I can familiarize myself with to get a good head start with understanding Sentry? I have no background in anything Sentry related. Yes, there are workshops that our team runs pretty frequently. Sentry.io/resources, I believe, is the URL. Let's take a look. Sentry.io/resources. There is a live demo for Intro to Sentry bi-weekly. I would recommend doing that. Here is the Bug Us Live session that we're doing right now. But there are quite a few workshops that we've done over the past years and years and years that have a lot of Sentry knowledge. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at these resources. And I think that puts us at the end of the session. For those people that were hanging out, asking questions, interacting, thank you so much. My name is Sergey, once again, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks. I think there will be a summary survey feedback thing posted at the end. Feel free to leave some comments, feedback. Helps us make sure that we are doing the right things as we are preparing these workshops, thinking about new ideas, and helping you have a better experience of using Sentry. That's it. Thanks so much.